Greetings from the South, Southern Adventist University. You'll be hearing my distinguished colleague, Dr. Michael Hossel, later this week in the evenings, and we are delighted to be here. I want to talk to you this week, today, and all week long about Ellen White and the Civil War. The Civil War was a defining moment for America. It made all the difference in the world regarding our history. The Revolution, as Shelby Foote, historian, said, did what it did. And our involvement in Europe with World War I, World War II, did what they did. But the Civil War defined us as a nation. The Revolution was not complete. There were still slaves in this country, but the Civil War ended slavery. You can take 19th century American history and divide it right down the middle, and at the center is the Civil War. Everything prior to that, the years prior to the Civil War, led up to it, and the years afterward flow out of it. And Seventh-day Adventists were at the heart of the Civil War. Some of Ellen White's most remarkable statements relate to events in the Civil War. Now, I've been on sabbatical this last semester, and I've been working on my next book, and you're going to hear about it this week. Civil War Prophet. So, I want to talk to you about Ellen White's prophetic ministry. Can I get my, there we go. I want to talk to you about, let's get me synchronized here. There we go. We are presently in the Civil War sesquicentennial of the Civil War, the 150-year anniversary. The years 2011 to 2015 are the 150-year anniversary of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The American Civil War is very important to Seventh-day Adventists. We need to spend time thinking about it, to have a basic awareness of the Civil War and what happened. There are a number of reasons, but I'd like to share two. First of all, the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church was formally organized in May of 1863. That was 150 years ago, last month. And next month, July 1 through 3, will be the anniversary of the most famous battle of the Civil War, Gettysburg, and also the downfall of Vicksburg. The Seventh-day Adventist Church was born in perilous times, right in the middle of the Civil War. And we could spend the whole week discussing our organization, how it came to be, what happened during that time. But my focus is on Ellen White. And so the second reason why the Civil War is important, Ellen White gave some remarkable insights into the war that are still relevant today. And I want to talk to you about that all week long, the relevancy of these statements. Let me give you an overview of where we're going this week. Today I'm going to talk about Ellen White as a Yankee prophet. Someone came up to me and said, "What do you mean, Yankee prophet? Isn't that somewhat of a derogatory term?" I'll explain what I mean here as I get into the presentation. But I want to walk you through, hold your breath for a moment, 40 years of history prior to the Civil War this morning. I will be heavy on the history, but I want to show you the relevance of it and its connection with Seventh-day Adventists and Ellen White. That will lay a groundwork for what I'll talk about the rest of the week. Next, on Monday, tomorrow, an abolitionist at heart. The abolitionists were those who wanted to abolish, hence abolitionists, abolish slavery. It was a significant movement in the years prior to the war. And Ellen White and Seventh-day Adventists had an interesting relationship to abolitionists. it's one that we Seventh-day Adventists really ought to understand better. We'll talk about that tomorrow. And then on Tuesday, a vision of war. 3 months before the Civil War, Ellen White had a vision where she saw the cannons booming and the dead and dying everywhere. It is a most interesting vision. I want to share with you the details of that vision and the context surrounding it. And then on Wednesday, God and Bull Run. Anybody know what I mean by Bull Run? That was the first major battle of the Civil War. Interestingly, Ellen White had a vision about that war, and she saw an angel come down in the midst of the battle. Ever heard about that before? I want to tell you that story on Wednesday. And then Thursday, she said a number of remarkable things about the war as it progressed. She set forth how the war would take place and the outcome of the war. I want to talk to you about some of the terrible battles, the details of the battles, and how they relate to what she said on Thursday. And then Friday, I want to end up with what I normally do when I present. I deal with Ellen White issues and Ellen White apologetics. That is Defending Ellen White. My first book, Ellen White Under Fire, was responding to the harsh criticisms of Ellen White on the web. And I will do that on Friday, specifically some of the unfair criticisms about statements she made regarding the Civil War and the races. And I'll respond to some of the hard sayings on Friday, and then we'll wrap it up on the Civil War. So that's going to be the focus this week. It won't be preaching per se. It will be a focus on Ellen White's writings in relationship to history. In my book, I really make an emphasis, the Ellen White Under Fire book, about understanding the historical context of Ellen White's writings. And that's what we're going to be doing all week long, looking at the history of the Civil War and how it illuminates her writings and how in touch, in line she was with history taking place around her. So that's where we're going this week. So let's get into today's presentation. The Yankee. Ellen White was a Yankee, born above the Mason-Dixie line, raised on New England values, sympathetic to the anti-slavery cause, a Northerner to the core. Now, when you get into the Civil War period, you have the terms Yankee and rebels, Yanks and Rebs. And Yankee became a derogatory term then. The rebels used that for the Yanks, and the Yanks used derogatory term Rebs for the Southerners. But prior to the Civil War, Yankee was not really a negative term. It simply was a way of describing people who lived in New England. And that's the sense I mean Ellen White was a Yankee. She was a Northerner to the core. She was born and raised in Maine, the northernmost and easternmost part of Yankee New England, known for its strong stance against slavery. And this is a new perspective on Ellen White I'd like you to think about here. We usually don't think of her in these terms, her background. She would marry another Yankee from Maine, James White, and raise her children in Yankee, Michigan. Now, I am a Southern boy, born and raised in Alabama, the South of the South, if you will. But I want to let you know I love Yanks. So we're okay, all right? Although her prophetic ministry began in Yankee territory, it would one day extend far beyond the Mason-Dixie line to the entire world, including the Deep South. And that's what's remarkable about Ellen White. And I think one of the most unfair charges against Ellen White by her critics is that she was a racist. They try to make a racist out of Ellen White. And when you read Ellen White, just even at a surface level, she's light years from being a racist. She's anything but a racist. And that also was a part of her upbringing in a territory that was against slavery. America began with slaves. It derived that from the British. But the North and the South took two different trajectories as the years went on. And the North focused more on the economy and slowly dispensed with slavery. The South grew stronger with its slavery and actually became a slave-holding economy, society. Slavery was the South's DNA. Now, the North while they moved away from slavery and didn't practice slavery openly, they were still full of racial prejudice prior to the Civil War. So the North was not perfect either. And Ellen White would not only condemn the South, she would also condemn the North in her strong writings prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War. The first 3 decades of Ellen's life, 1827 to 1857 approximately, were part of a fascinating and turbulent period in American history known as antebellum America. Perhaps you've heard that term before. Historians use it a lot. It's a Latin term that simply means before war, literally before the war. So the years prior to the Civil War are so significant in their relationship to the Civil War that they are called by that name, antebellum America. America during the years before the Civil War. Ellen White was born during that time. She grew up in antebellum America and began her early prophetic ministry in antebellum America. That was the historical context of Ellen and all the other Adventist life. And understanding it will throw all kinds of light and insight into her ministry. And antebellum America, in terms of the period, historians begin at different periods. Some begin it at 1800, others at 1815, others at 1820. Good arguments can be made for all of them. I prefer the 1815 date right after the War of 1812 ended. But wherever you begin it, historians are all united that it ended with the Civil War. Antebellum America ended with the Civil War. So what we want to do now is look at the historical context, 40 years, basically, from, I'm going to start at 1820 to 1860. We're going to cover 40 years of history. I want to look at it in relationship to Ellen White's youth and early ministry, and how the early Sabbatarian Adventists who became Seventh-day Adventists, how they interacted with these major political events that were transpiring around them. I want to look at the Millerites in a different way. I usually speak a lot on the Millerites and tell the stories of William Miller, but today I'm going to do it differently. I want to look at the larger framework of the Millerite movement. We often talk about our history in an isolated way. We just focus on the Millerite history. But what was going on in the rest of the nation during that time? I want to share that with you. Give the bigger picture. Take a perspective on the Millerite movement and early Adventism that we generally don't think about. That's the historical context. So we begin with perhaps the most significant event in antebellum America, the earliest, I should say, one of the earlier significant events in antebellum America that was a step towards civil war. And it relates to Ellen White and her birth. It's called the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Now, as I said earlier, Ellen White was born in Maine. She was born 1827. This event took place 7 years before Ellen White was born, but laid the context for her birth state. It had to do with the slave states and the free states. Over the years, the big struggle was admitting new states into the Union. Would it be a free state or a slave state? By the time you get to 1819, you had 11 slave states and 11 free states. And a request was made by Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state. But the distinguishing feature of this request is that Missouri would be the first state west of the Mississippi River. And that made it highly controversial because all that land in the west, slaveholders wanted to make it slave country. The North wanted to make it free. And their idea was not just because they were totally against slavery, but they learned that their economy without slaves worked better. And the economy was better. So that's what they were thinking in terms of this, of moving west. And so Missouri was very controversial. Can they still see that on the screen when I can't see it up here? Yeah, it's okay. I just want to make sure as I'm talking, when I'm looking at my screen, that you're seeing the same thing. Just getting adjusted here. So Missouri was very controversial. it upset the equilibrium. It began a debate for about 2 years. And in the Senate, you had this issue of congregational representation. The South fought for their territory. They wanted Missouri to become in the Union as a slave state, and the Northerners fought it. It was complicated when Maine, up in the upper corner, made a request to enter the Union as a free state. But the controversial issue was that Missouri was in that western part, past the Mississippi River. What would they do with that unorganized territory you'll see up on the left part of your screen? And so Henry Clay from Kentucky brokered a compromise. This was America's first great compromise, and here's the point: compromise with slavery. They would leave the slaveholders alone in the South, and Missouri would come in the Union as a slave state, which it did in 1821, and Maine would come in as a free state, which it did in 1820. Remember, this is a 2-year controversial issue. I'm just hitting the highlights. But also, what helped satisfy the passions, you'll notice at the left part of the screen, down right above the arc, the yellow Arkansas territory, you'll see the 36-30-degree red line at the bottom of Missouri. Here was the vote. There would be no slavery above that line. This satisfied the North. The only slavery above that line would be in Missouri. That satisfied the Southerners. And so that's the context in which Maine came into the Union, and 7 years later, Ellen White was born. But now this issue of a line was a serious thing to one of the founding fathers of America. On April 22, 1820, the aged Thomas Jefferson wrote to John Holmes, a leader in Maine, that the Missouri Compromise, he said, like a fireball in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. The idea of a geographical line coinciding with a marked principle, moral and political, once conceived and held up to the angry passions of men, will never be obliterated, and every new irritation will mark it deeper and deeper. He was talking about that 36-30 line. That satisfied the nationalists temporarily. But as Jefferson predicted, it would come back and haunt America. And I'll come to that here in a few minutes as we go years down the road. Robert Pierce Forbes, in his excellent book, The Missouri Compromise and its Aftermath, he put it best when he said that the Missouri Compromise is best understood as a flash of lightning that illuminated the realities of sectional power in the United States, the section of the North versus the section of the South, and ignited a fire that smoldered for a generation, and then, when circumstances were right, burst into flame, and it actually smoldered for about 30 years. But it set the stage for one of the great compromises, and many compromises America would make with slavery. And let me just jump ahead and tell you that Ellen White, during the years of the Civil War, when she wrote about this issue, she condemned not only the South, but she condemned the North for its compromises with the South. And while she didn't mention it specifically, this first major compromise is certainly what she had in mind, because you will find, if you read through the Review and Herald over the years, you will find the Missouri Compromise of 1820 mentioned numerous times. And that's one thing I want to do as we go through the material this morning, is show you how the Adventists reacted to it and wrote about it in the Review and Herald. Another event that took place in Ellen White's youth, her elementary school years, if you will, is what is called the Second Great Awakening. It was America's greatest revival, the first Great Awakening that happened 50 years earlier. And this one emerged, and it was a very intense, emotionally charged revival. It swept across the American landscape and brought massive conversions. And it really set the stage for the Millerite movement, the Second Great Advent Awakening. But this is the Second Great Awakening. Almost all historians of American religious history recognize this as a great and significant event. At the heart of it was Charles Finney. We could call him the Billy Graham of the 1830s. Now, Ellen White was a young girl during this time, and she experienced this. At the heart of it were Methodist ministers. And if you look at the Millerites, many of them were Methodists. Many of our Seventh-day Adventist pioneers came out of Methodism. Charles Finney developed his own style of evangelizing, and I could go on and on about Finney, a fascinating character. He taught a type of perfectionism which appealed to Americans because during this time, Americans were very optimistic about the future. They were what we would call post-millennialists. That is, they believed that Christ was coming after the millennium, and so the big job in this new country was to perfect it so they could usher in the millennium. So they believed that mankind would get better and better and better until the millennium came, and then Christ would come at the end of the millennium. And Finney appealed to that in his preaching. He called them to sanctification, to Christian growth, to perfection. And what happened as he went through Western New England, Western New York, wherever he preached, abolitionists would emerge. Now, Finney himself was not an abolitionist. He did not get involved in the abolitionist movement, but his preaching fueled many abolitionists. And I will talk about the abolitionists in more detail tomorrow as I lay a groundwork for Ellen White's experience as an abolitionist. So Finney set the groundwork for a great hostility and preaching against slavery. 1831, Ellen White was 4 years old. A number of interesting and significant events took place in 1831. One of them was on January 1, 1831. William Lloyd Garrison published the first issue of The Liberator and emerged as the most outspoken and radical abolitionist in the antebellum United States. Now, I will say more about Garrison tomorrow. His importance cannot be overestimated in the abolitionist movement and his influence as the years went on in antebellum America and even during the war. But the publishing of The Liberator, the first major abolitionist journal, was a significant event. On February 12, 1831, an event that not too many people are familiar with, it was a day many Americans anticipated with a sense of impending danger. It was heralded by the media as the Great Eclipse of 1831. There was an eclipse that they had predicted and believed would arrive on that day and would be the darkest day in the history of the United States, and Americans were terrified. They believed this might be the end of the world, and so they all waited in bated breath, if you will, and on that day they searched the skies, and they looked for this great event to transpire, and they watched, and they waited, and it was most unimpressive. It was not much of anything. All the to-do was about the media blitz prior to this event. However, one preacher, and there were a few others, some preachers preached about the signs of the end, but one preacher in particular saw this eclipse, small eclipse, as a sign. In Southampton County, Virginia, one preacher saw it, the February 12 eclipse, as a sign to begin an insurrection. Nat Turner, he was a slave who was also a preacher, and because of that, he was allowed to go and preach in different groups of slaves, and that eclipse for him was a sign to engage in a major insurrection, a rebellion against slavery in the South. And he waited till the right time. In August of that year, 1831, he launched his insurrection. He took a group of men with him, and they slew about 60 Caucasians, slaveholders. And he was apprehended, and they hanged him. This was a significant event because it sent fear throughout the South. There had been other insurrections, but not on a magnitude of this. They thought, if Nat Turner could do this, what about other slaves? In fact, decades after the Nat Turner issue, and right before the Civil War, when the tension was at its height, Southerners still remembered Nat Turner, and they thought there would be a repeat of that. American slavery historian Eugene Genovese suggested that Turner's revolt was a turning point in the movement towards the United States Civil War because it stiffened the resolve of both abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates. In other words, those in the North, those in the South. It strengthened their resolve. And as I'm walking through this material this morning, one thing you will notice is that I see all these major events as a step towards civil war, and at the center and core of it all was slavery. And I'll talk about this later in the week, but one of the most hotly debated issues regarding the Civil War is the cause of the Civil War. Was it slavery or was it something else? Well, I'm going to argue, along with mainline historians, that slavery was at the core. And I'm touching on that here because these early events were all steps towards civil war, and they were all interconnected with the issue of slavery. But I'll say more on that later this week. An event that we Adventists are familiar with, the falling of the stars in 1833. Young Ellen slept through the night as a young 6-year-old, but the stars fell, and this had a much greater impact, far greater impact than the little eclipse of 1831. And we often talk about this as a fulfillment of the signs in the sky, and so we should. But I want to look at it from a different perspective here and listen to what one abolitionist said about it. His name was Frederick Douglass, a slave who had obtained freedom and became the most outspoken abolitionist, black abolitionist in America. In fact, the most famous black person in antebellum America, and I should say in 19th century America. And Douglass is probably my favorite, I should say one of my favorite characters in the 19th century. I deeply admire Douglass, and I will be citing him frequently tomorrow. But he was a young slave. He crawled out of bed early that morning, and he saw these stars falling. And this is what he said. "I witnessed this gorgeous spectacle and was awestruck," he later recalled. "The air seemed filled with bright descending messengers from the sky." And Douglass was gifted. He was eloquent. You can see that in his description here. He was a great orator, one of the great public speakers of the 19th century. "The air seemed filled with bright descending messengers from the sky. It was about daybreak when I saw this sublime scene. I was not without the suggestion at the moment that it might be the harbinger of the coming of the Son of Man. And in my then state of mind, I was prepared to hail him as my friend and deliverer. I had read that the stars shall fall from heaven, and they were now falling." So this event impacted many. Ellen White would write years later in The Great Controversy that this event drew the minds of many to the second coming of Christ. And Frederick Douglass was certainly one of those. Well, the falling of the stars gave credibility to another preacher, William Miller, who began his preaching on the soon return of Jesus in 1831. Miller had fought in the War of 1812, built his home in Lohampton, New York, converted, and was a well-to-do farmer. And in 2 years, from 1816 to 1818, he devoted himself to study of the Bible. He was well off in his farm. He delegated out to the workers in his family, and he spent day after day studying the Scriptures, particularly the prophetic portions. And he had read lots of history, and so he looked at the prophetic portions of Scripture, Daniel and Revelation. He was drawn to that time prophecy we all know in Daniel 8:14, on the 2300 days shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And he looked at history. And at the end of that 2 years of intensive study, he concluded that Jesus was coming around the year 1843. But then he was just a farmer, and so he felt somebody else should take this message. So he only shared it with friends and family over the years until in 1831, by a series of providences, he was led to preaching. So he went public with his message in 1831. So Miller preached from 1831 to 1844. It wasn't until the late 1830s that he encountered Joshua V. Himes, who was also a great preacher, well known in Boston. Himes was an abolitionist as well, an outspoken opponent of slavery in the South. But he picked up Miller's cause, and he put Miller on the map. And it swelled into what I like to call the mighty Millerite movement from 1840 to 1844. They focused in 1843, but the time passed. There was a minor disappointment. and they realized the time change. They added a 0, as you might recall. I won't go into all of those details now. And they determined it was on October 22, 1844, that Jesus was going to come. The Millerites focused on this event. They waited for Jesus to come. Young Ellen was converted in those years, and they all waited on October 22, 1844, for Jesus to come. And as we all know, Jesus did not come. It's known in history as the Great Disappointment. But out of the Millerite movement, there were several different groups that emerged. One of those groups obtained a new understanding into what happened on that day, that it had to do with a celestial event in heaven. Jesus transferring from one phase of his high priestly ministry to another phase. And in the years 1848 to 1850, as they came together on various doctrines, those are what are known in Adventist history as the historic Sabbath conferences. They had already accepted the Sabbath, and they consolidated key doctrinal teachings and developed the foundational doctrines that would eventually become Seventh-day Adventism. Additionally, in December of 1844, just 2 months after the disappointment, Ellen White had her first vision. This changed her life dramatically. And I'm just focusing on the Millerites now and this issue. In a moment, we're going to broaden our horizon in what was going on now. But of course, for us, the Seventh-day Adventists, these are vitally important stories here. She saw the people of God walking on a great path. I should say, let me back up and give you the context. She was very disappointed. She knelt down in a home. She was sick with the home of Elizabeth Haynes, a friend of hers, and they were together. They were seeking God for insight about the disappointment. And they got on their knees and prayed, and at that point, Ellen was taken off into vision. And she saw the people of God walking on a narrow path, a bright light behind them that illuminated their pathway. And there was a bright light ahead of them, and at the end of the path was Jesus. The vision is bathed in light. I've got to discipline myself here because with my students, a class I teach to students on Ellen White's prophetic ministry, to ministerial students, I usually spend an hour or two on this vision. So let's just summarize it in a nutshell. It's bathed in light. She understood the bright light behind them as the midnight cry, the Millerite message that Christ was coming on October 22, 1844. Eventually, that was understood as the Great Judgment message. It kept their path illuminated. They were never to forget what God had done in the Millerite movement and never to forget the message of October 22, 1844 and the message of the judgment. But the light ahead of them represented the second coming of Christ. And by the way, these were themes that Ellen White would emphasize for the rest of her prophetic ministry. The message of the judgment, the soon return of Christ, the premillennial return of Christ in the clouds of heaven, and of course, Jesus at the end of the path. A theme that Ellen White would enunciate for the next 70 years of her prophetic ministry is that Christianity, at its core, is a relationship with the person of Jesus Christ. And salvation comes by Him and Him alone. And Seventh-day Adventists, above all other Christians, should be foremost in uplifting Christ before the world. All of those themes were in embryonic form in this inaugural vision. So it's very important, very important. But now let's step back. We usually tell this story of the Millerites and the birth of Adventism in an isolated way without looking at the broader picture of what was happening in the world and in America. Let's do that just now. Meanwhile, and this is in the fall of 1844, the rest of the nation was focused on the presidential campaign during the fall of 1844. And this is not just isolated historical details here. This all relates to where it would all end up in the Civil War and our own people's involvement in it. So they were focused on the presidential campaign during the fall of 1844. The Democratic nominee, James K. Polk, ran on a platform that supported territorial expansion. What is territorial expansion? That's all the vast regions, the vast domain out in the west that was unclaimed territory. That was not a part of America. And there's been a book written about Polk, about his expansion of America and its destiny. Interestingly, a part of that, there were several candidates for the presidency. One of them was the Mormon, founder of the Mormons, Joseph Smith. Unfortunately, though, his campaign was cut short when he was murdered in June of 1844. And Polk eventually won his victory. His victory would be significant in terms of manifest destiny, a very important term in American history. Manifest destiny is the popular idea that the nation was destined by God and history to expand its boundaries over a vast area. And this is the basis upon which Polk ran his administration, to expand Americas over the vast area in the West. The pictures you see there are some of the symbolism. The one at the bottom of the screen, the symbol of a spirit of America moving across the land, acquiring more and more domain. The upper picture there, looking over the western horizon to obtain that vast region of unclaimed land. The enthusiasm for this idea reached its peak during the President Polk's administration and reopened the painful controversy over slavery. And Mexico played a big role here. There was a debt issue, and tensions with Mexico heightened to a significant degree. And finally, Polk declared war on Mexico in 1846. And many accused Polk of really starting this war just to gain more territory. It was very controversial in America. Americans didn't like the idea of this war. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the founder of Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism was an intellectual movement that was very significant in antebellum America. In a nutshell, it's the idea that man has within him the innate spark of intellect and power. He can determine what reality is. He can transcend himself. It's more complicated than that, but in a nutshell, that's what Transcendentalism is. And Emerson was a leader in that movement. But Emerson did not like Polk's war. And I should say that almost all the Transcendentalists would become major abolitionists. I'll say more about that tomorrow. So Emerson correctly predicted that, quote, he wrote, "The United States will conquer Mexico," this was during the war, "but it will be as the man swallows the arsenic, which brings him down in turn. Mexico will poison us." And was he ever right? Because even then, you had the South who wanted to seize the new territories obtained from Mexico and make them slave-holding territories. You had others who just wanted to gain more territory. And then there were those who felt that this whole war thing for territory was terribly wrong. In fact, our key founder, Joseph Bates, was angry over Polk's war with Mexico. He condemned the war and called the United States a, quote, heaven-daring, soul-destroying, slave-holding, neighbor-murdering country. And if you read the story of Joseph Bates in Adventist history, that makes perfect sense. Bates was outspoken and straightforward, and that fits his character with precision. What is interesting about the war with Mexico, they eventually went on into the halls of Montezuma, as it says, and won the war. But the war with Mexico, the soldiers, American soldiers who fought in the war with Mexico, it was really a dress rehearsal for another war that would come a little over a decade later. Because the soldiers, American soldiers that fought side by side in the war with Mexico would, in the Civil War, fight against each other. The war of friend against friend, brother against brother. That's an interesting irony of the war with Mexico that historians often point out. So then we transition at the end of the decade of the 40s into the 50s. As the decade of the 1840s came to a close, Americans were proud of the vast new lands they had acquired from Mexico. They were poised for westward expansion and greatness, but little did they realize that these territories would become a major point of controversy between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Now, let me just say a word as I get into the 1850s. The 1850s was the decade of destiny for antebellum America. That was the climax of it all. That was a decade of intense conflict when the gulf between the North and the South would deepen and widen. And that decade literally laid the foundation for the war in the early 1860s. And our Seventh-day Adventist pioneers were very much a part of the 1850s. They were in tune with everything that was happening. They had one ear to their Bibles and looking for Jesus' soon coming, and the other ear to what was happening in political events. Sabbatarian Adventists, by this time, had established their core doctrines. And as we get into the 1850s, here's a nutshell of what was happening with our Seventh-day Adventists. They actually weren't Seventh-day Adventists until 1863. They were Sabbatarian Adventists during the 1850s. The decade began with a bang. In 1850, there were 200 Sabbatarian Adventists. In just 2 years, by 1852, they grew from 200 to 2,000. So it literally started with a bang. And they developed a deepening understanding of Ellen White's prophetic gift. This was an issue of controversy, and they went back and forth seeking to understand how the prophetic gift functioned in relationship to Scripture. And they focused on church organization. In fact, you could describe the 1850s as a time of organizational fever. There were lots of debates in the Review and Herald about organization. It would culminate in the organization of the General Conference, the state, and also the Michigan Conference by 1863, and a formal church organization. But that took place during the 1850s. So they were focused on Jesus' soon return. They were focused on organizing themselves, but they were also listening to what was happening around them. They were very alert to that. During the spring and summer of 1850, while Sabbatarian Adventists were engaged in refining their basic doctrines, members of the 31st Congress debated questions of great importance to the Union. Questions that, if not handled delicately, would divide the country and marshal it into war. And the big question was this: what should we do with the territories obtained from Mexico? And that was the debate, because you know what the South wanted to do? Make them slave territory. And the North wanted it to be free country so they could grow and expand their economy. So it was a hot issue in the Senate. At this perilous moment in America's history, the aged and eminent senator from Kentucky, Henry Clay, proposed a plan of compromise to settle the differences between the North and the South. It would later be known as the Compromise of 1850, another one of America's great compromises with slavery. One of those compromises that Ellen White would later vehemently condemn. It's known in history, discussed by historians, that some of the great speeches ever made in the history of the Senate were regarding this compromise of 1850. We could talk about that at length, but we won't. After months of long debate, Senator Stephen Douglas brought Clay's compromise with its 5 measures to fruition so that it passed the Senate and was signed into law by President Millard Fillmore, president at the time. Among the measures were the admission of California, and that was the hot topic, is what to do with California. California was admitted as a free state. This was a concession to the North. Clay did this in such a way that it would concede to the North and concede to the South. In that sense, it was a compromise. So California was a free state, a concession to the North, and a more stringent fugitive slave law, a major concession to the South. A big concession to the South. Now, the fugitive slave law had already been around many, many years, but the North really wasn't enforcing it. And so what this act did was tighten it up. And for the first time, marshals had the American government backing them up as they pursued runaway slaves in the North. And the controversial aspect of it was the marshals could grab anybody, any bystander, and make them a part of the posse. It doesn't matter what your convictions were. If you were an abolitionist or an Adventist, no matter what you believed, if the marshal saw you standing by, he would seize you and say, you are a part of this posse. You are forced to help me pursue this slave. And so the fugitive slave law sent waves to the north. It really angered many Northerners. Because while they weren't really, while they tended to be prejudiced against those of different color, they still were not in favor of slavery. And they didn't like slavery put in their face. And so many Northerners, especially the abolitionists who were convicted slavery was morally wrong, they really resisted this law. Frederick Douglass, who by 1852 was the most famous black man in America and the most well-known abolitionist, in a speech given on August 11, 1852, before a large convention, Frederick Douglass condemned what he called the hell-born enactment of the fugitive slave law. He said, "This vile, infernal law," he roared to an individual in the audience who had made a comment. He said, "It makes it criminal for you, sir, to carry out the principles of Christianity. It forbids you the right to do right, forbids you to show mercy, forbids you to follow the example of the Good Samaritan." That captured the abolitionist impulse and hatred of the fugitive slave law, and many Northerners as well. The Review and Herald reacted strongly to the fugitive slave law. Adventists, Sabbatarian Adventists, who were basically all abolitionists, hated the fugitive slave law. The pages of the Review and Herald, Adventists condemned the fugitive slave law. One contributor referred to it as an atrocious bargain. This is all in the Review now. They held no punches back then. Being politically correct was no concern back then. The foulest stain that ever blotted the history of any nation. Another Sabbatarian referred to it as a damning feature of this our vaunted free government. That's just a few excerpts. I could share with you page after page in the Review how they condemned slavery. In fact, I did a word search. Do you know that from 1850 to 1860, they used the word slavery over 18,000 times? Our pioneers were really in touch with the day, and they condemned slavery without hesitation, unanimously in the pages of the Review. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. The most far-reaching reaction to the fugitive slave law was Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe grew up in a family of ministers and abolitionists, and she grew up to hate slavery, and she was very upset with the 1850 Compromise, the passing of the fugitive slave law. She came up with a story about two slave families and originally published it in an installment of articles in the National Era, an abolitionist magazine. Then in 1852, she put it in book form. And it was about Uncle Tom, a Christ-like slave, and at the end of the book depicts Uncle Tom dying by a cruel beating, the Christ-like Uncle Tom dying from a beating. And it brought the horrors of slavery face to face with the readers. It depicted how terrible it really was. And the book became an instant bestseller. In fact, it's become one of the most important books in American history. Today, in literature classes across America, it is still required reading. It's been that significant over the years. Ellen White made some negative comments about this book. Why would she say something negative about a book that did so much good, as I'm about to tell you? I will deal with her comments on Friday. Got to keep you here all week long for a camp meeting, right? So she presented slavery in such highly charged emotional terms, and it impacted Northerners. They bought the book. Here's one example. The tough-minded editor of the New York Tribune and supporter of the Compromise of 1850 now, Greenlee supported it. Horace Greenlee read through the book on a train ride from Boston to Washington, D.C. By the time he reached Springfield, he was weeping so profusely that he had to get off the train and spend the night to compose himself. Many Northerners reacted that way. Keep in mind, they were not really in favor of slavery, but as long as it stayed in the South, they didn't worry about it. So they didn't really think much of slavery. They had no idea of the cruel torture people experienced in the South. And suddenly, they read this book. They were face to face with the horrors of slavery, at least the way it was depicted by Mrs. Stowe. And it impacted them emotionally. And so Northerners began to think differently about slavery. They became more negative about it as a result of this book. The impact of this book cannot be overestimated. Since Southerners, let me give you the Southern reaction to the book here. Southerners, what shall we say? They didn't like it. Since they viewed slavery as a natural, biblically sanctioned institution, they felt Stowe's book was a direct attack on their institutions, social system, and way of life. One example of the South's vehemence was when the editor of Southern Literary Messenger referred to Stowe as the vile wretch in petticoats who could write such a volume. See, they were protective and defensive of their institution of slavery. And they defended it biblically. I'll say more about this later in the week when I talk about Ellen White's strong condemnation of religious leaders in the South. But they believed they were doing God's will. They believed they were helping the black race, see? So they reacted very strongly against Stowe's book because it condemned them. And yet, ironically, Stowe endeavored to be diplomatic in the book towards the South, because if you read the book, the stories, it's very interesting the way she put it together. Within a month of the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, pro-slavery novels were released in the South that portrayed slavery in a positive light. And by the time of the Civil War, at least 29 anti-Tom novels had been published. None of these novels, however, even came close to the success of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin thus galvanized the attitudes of both the North and the South on the issue of slavery. Within a decade of its publication, the novel had sold more than 2 million copies in the United States. That is a staggering figure of that day. That would be a bestseller, a multi-million bestseller of today, and was a major contributing factor in widening and deepening the divide between the North and the South. I know this is a lot of history here. You still with me? You see the relevance of this? This is all going somewhere. Trust me, it is. An illustration of its impact is a story passed along by Stowe's family about an interview she had with Abraham Lincoln on or around Thanksgiving Day, 1862. And some historians debate if this event ever happened, but I've traced it based on a specialist in Stowe to an original source. I obtained the source, and so I believe that this exchange between Lincoln and Stowe did take place. So Lincoln greeted Stowe with these words, "Why, Mrs. Stowe, right glad to see you." Then with a humorous twinkle in his eye, and this is based on her family, their description of this event, he said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." And so that just gives you a sense of the impact of this book. Ellen White reacted very negatively to the fugitive slave law. It was not until 1859 that she spoke out against it. Some ask, why did she wait till 1859 when it had been going on through a decade? Well, if you look at the year 1859 and 1858, a number of interesting events took place that heightened the impact of the fugitive slave law. Several major cases, law cases in the country, in the courts, really highlighted the fugitive slave law and brought it back to the attention of everyone and reinforced the American government's backing of the fugitive slave law. In that backdrop, she wrote in Testimonies, Volume 1. Ellen White was outspoken on these matters. She said, "When the laws of men conflict with the word and law of God, we are to obey the latter, whatever the consequences may be. The law of our land requiring us to deliver a slave to his master, we are not to obey." Remember, keep in mind, that is even when a marshal commands that you become a part of his posse, do not obey. Now that's radical. That's tough. She is telling Adventists to disobey the law of the United States government. It's nothing less than that here. This is radical and bold. The slave is not the property of any man. God is his rightful master. And man has no right to take God's workmanship into his hands and claim him as his own. That's Ellen White. That's why I will show you tomorrow why she was an outspoken abolitionist. In the literary context of the statement, she's not encouraging disobedience to all laws of the land. She wrote, "We have men placed over us for rulers and laws to govern the people. Were it not for these laws, the condition of the world would be worse than it is now." She declared, "I was shown that the Lord still has something to do with the laws of the land." Again, this portrays for us Ellen White's balance in things that she said. She was so balanced and full of common sense and good reasoning and an understanding of the times in which she lived. So while respecting the laws of the government in general, she condemned the fugitive slave law in particular as a fundamental violation of moral principle. And there is an interesting relationship between Harriet Beecher Stowe and Ellen White. And I think in this book I'm writing now, that's going to be my last chapter on Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it's not written yet, but Harriet Beecher Stowe. I'm jumping ahead. But this a hint for Friday, but Harriet Beecher Stowe believed that the book that she wrote, Uncle Tom's Cabin, it was given to her by God through visions. She claimed that she wrote it through visions. Very interesting, so I'm going to make a comparison there. Okay, let's get on. We'll talk about that later. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This had to be the most politically charged event of the 1850s. Historians recognize this event as epic regarding steps towards the Civil War. It made it possible for the Kansas-Nebraska territories, shown in orange there in the picture, to open to slavery. The Missouri Compromise had prevented this from happening since 1820. Now remember, I said it's the act of the Compromise of 1820. The embers smoldered for decades, and they eventually would catch into flame again. That happened with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because basically this act dissolved that 36-degree 30 line. Remember, slavery could not go above this line. They dissolved that and termed the approach popular sovereignty, which meant that territory was now open to slaveholders as well as those who were not slaveholders. It was up for grabs. In a speech, Lincoln said, "This will incite war in the Kansas territory." And he was spot on, because that's precisely what happened. After the Kansas-Nebraska bill passed the Senate in March 4, our Adventist folk reacted strongly to it. And what I'm about to read you, the Adventist basically reflected the view of most of the North on this issue. So the Review and Herald informed its readers, and this is James White writing here, that the slavery question is, quote, "now revived again in its worst form. The greatest excitement prevails in regard to it throughout the country. Politicians speak of it as an act which menaces the freedom of our institutions and permanency of our union." Now, White is citing other authors. They often did that. They would pull from other abolitionist magazines of the day and cite them in the Review and Herald regarding the slavery issue. They speak of it as they speak of it as well calculated to awaken the worst apprehensions and the most fearful forebodings of future calamity. They warn the people that the dearest interest of freedom and the Union are in imminent peril. So again, our Seventh-day Adventists were keenly aware of what was happening, and they were against all of these issues related to slavery. Now see, the clock says noon, but they told me I have till 12:15. All right? Okay. I don't want to impinge on lunch. That's a death knell to this presentation, okay? So I'm going to endeavor to finish up here in about 15 minutes. The embers of the Missouri Compromise of 1820 that had smoldered for over 3 decades, as I said before, now burst into flame. And Thomas Jefferson's fear of the angry passions of men over geopolitical division in the country had come true. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, writes Civil War historian, the preeminent Civil War historian, James M. McPherson, quote, "may have been the most important single event pushing the nation toward war." In reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you have the rise of the Republican Party, which continues to this day. That's our same Republicans of today. Within the Republican Party during the 1850s and 1860s, one could find three basic orientation towards the slavery issue. The conservative Republicans tended to want to compromise more with the slaveholders. The moderates were in the middle. They were against expanding slavery in the West, but they wanted to satisfy the slaveholders in the South. Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, was our first elected Republican president, and Lincoln was a moderate. That probably is what helped him get elected, because he was a moderate, in the middle. Then you have the radical Republicans. These guys were against any compromise with slavery. These radical Republicans, as they came to be known, never formally organized, but found leadership in Pennsylvania Congressman Thaddeus Stevens in the House of Representatives. While they did not think alike on all matters, what they did have in common was a strong opposition to slavery as morally wrong. Now, what's the relevance of this detail regarding the radical Republicans? It is this. Ellen White and the Adventists harmonized with the radical Republicans. In fact, if you read the Review and Herald during those years, you would have to say, these guys are radical Republicans. Again, this is back in that context now. Context then. Not saying that, all Adventists should be Republicans or Democrats today. Adventists are in both camps, see, today. But back then, this is not that they officially connected with that party, but they reflected its sentiments. Reading through the Review and Herald in the 1850s and 1860s, for example, one will find printed excerpts from articles and speeches by the radical Republicans such as William H. Seward, who became Lincoln's Secretary of State, although by then Seward had moved from a radical position to a more moderate position. That's how he was elected with Lincoln. And Thaddeus Stevens. Now, I'm going to ask a daring question. How many saw Steven Spielberg's movie, Lincoln? Have seen it yet? Okay. Tommy Lee Jones, veteran actor Tommy Lee Jones, played Thaddeus Stevens in Steven Spielberg's film, Lincoln. It's now out on DVD. I believe this is an outstanding film. I'm daring to recommend the movie at camp meeting. But this is a historical film, very accurate, not precise in all of its details, but on the whole, it is very accurate. It presents some very moving scenes of Lincoln, and Tommy Lee Jones' portrayal or depiction of Thaddeus Stevens is spot on target. It is remarkable. And seeing this film makes that history come alive. And that's important for us because that's a part of our history as Seventh-day Adventists, is that era. In Kansas, things got worse. Bloodshed took place. You had the pro-slavery forces and the anti-slavery forces clash in Kansas. So much so that they called it Bleeding Kansas. They were fighting for territory. At the heart of it was the renowned John Brown, who led a group and butchered several white slaveholders. He became famous for that, and it was dubbed Bleeding Kansas. So things got worse. And in the Senate, things worsened as well. All of this is a reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that significant event. And this is a depiction of the beating of Charles Sumner, a radical Republican, in the Senate in 1856. He made an inflammatory speech against slavery in the South and made a derogatory remark about one of the other senators. And Preston Brooks was a leader at the time there in the government, and he took offense because that was one of his relatives. And when the Senate was empty, Thaddeus Stevens was at his desk writing vigorously. Preston Brooks walked in slowly, said a few words, took out his cane, and began to beat Sumner. Literally beat him senseless. Sumner was a big man, and he was in his desk, and he rose up so much so he pulled the desk out of the bolts in the floor, but it was too late. I mean, Sumner just beat him to a pulp, and he was out of the Senate for 2 years. Northerners were outraged with this event. The Review and Herald editors condemned the beating of Sumner. They liked Sumner. He was a radical Republican. And that was pretty much the sentiment in the North. It was an outrageous act of brutality, reflecting how the South really was, brutal slaveholders. But for the South, the gentleman in the South, if you insult a relative, it's your duty to defend your name. And so that's the backdrop in which Preston Brooks went there. So the South unanimously praised Brooks. So you see, this deepened the divide between the North and the South. It made it deeper and wider. During the Republican Senate convention in Springfield, Illinois, when Lincoln was nominated as a candidate for U.S. Senator, he gave his famous, often quoted House Divided speech on June 16, 1858. And this speech was important to Adventists. They liked this speech. Let me read some of the key excerpts from it that we all remember. It was during this speech that Lincoln stated some of his most famous, often quoted lines. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he declared. "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all another." Do you know that this entire lengthy speech, Uriah Smith considered it so important that he published the entire speech in the Review and Herald? And he, of course, called Lincoln Honorable Abraham Lincoln. He was not the president yet. And he made some very interesting comments about the speech and put it in an eschatological context regarding the coming of Christ, because for them, the slavery issue was a sign of the imminent coming of Christ. John Brown. Anybody familiar with John Brown if you've read American history? A number of you. John Brown, I find to be a most fascinating character in antebellum America. He was what we would call, and I'll identify this more tomorrow, a violent abolitionist. He believed in ending slavery with violence, and he did so in Bleeding, Kansas. He laid low after that event. He became very famous because of that. He laid low, but he plotted, and he planned, and he got financial support from Northerners, and he planned a raid on Harper's Ferry, the armory and arsenal there. He took a group of about 13 men, 5 of them were black, and they went to this armory to seize the weaponry. And he was hoping that slaves would join his cause, and he would take an army of slaves with weapons down in the South and free all the slaves and create a massive insurrection and end slavery. His motives were good, but he used violence. And at the beginning of the raid, things went well, but then it went downhill, and the authorities were alerted, and they sent troops there, the U.S. Marines, along with the militia, and Brown retreated to an engine room there at the armory, and the troops surrounded them. The Marines were commanded by none other than, and these are one of the many ironies of the Civil War, none other than Robert E. Lee, who would become the commanding general of the Confederates during the Civil War. And they called for Brown to surrender. He refused. They stormed the engine room, bayoneted a number of the men. Some escaped. Brown was wounded. He was arrested, put in jail for several weeks. During that time, he wrote and he set forth his case, and he was executed on December 2 of 1859. And on the left side of the screen, you see him walking out for the execution. That is a depiction. There's a lot of caricatures of Brown, and historians don't believe that he really kissed an African-American baby at that time, but he did love African Americans. But he was executed in front of 1,500 soldiers and a huge audience, and many were impressed with the dignity in which he died. And the impact of Brown's death on the country was profound. On the day of his execution, organized expressions of sympathy could be found taking place over much of the North. Bells tolled, minute guns fired, prayer meetings assembled, memorial resolutions were adopted. I mean, this is significant. In the weeks following Brown's death, the Transcendentalists, who I mentioned before, hailed him as a martyr and likened him to Christ. The South, however, saw Brown as the devil incarnate because they remembered Nat Turner's insurrection. And here were white people supporting a white abolitionist. That was the Southerners' worst nightmare. They pictured them coming into the South and freeing the slaves, and then the slaves would turn on them. It was a nightmare for them. And so they condemned it. And when they saw all this big to-do about Brown in the North, it really embedded them deeper in their hatred of the North and their defensiveness of their slave-holding institution. Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example, wrote that Brown would make the gallows as glorious as the cross. And Henry David Thoreau declared, "He is not Brown any longer, he is an angel of light." The Review and Herald even referred to Brown as this remarkable man, and none other than Ellen White commented about Brown. However, we have nothing in her writings. This is from J.N. Loughborough, who heard a conversation, or heard her comment about this incident. He and James were talking about how foolish Brown's raid was. And Ellen commented and said, "Gentlemen, there's another perspective on it." So according to Loughborough, she remarked that Brown's raid was not for plunder or murder, but to secure for the slaves what our Declaration of Independence says: all men are entitled to liberty. And she had just written, the year prior to making the statement, the most significant abolitionist, what I believe to be one of the most significant abolitionist statements in antebellum America. And I will cover those writings tomorrow. Shortly before she was taken to the gallows for hanging, Brown wrote that he wrote his last words on a scrap of paper and handed it to the jail guard. The cryptic prophetic words read, and these are often quoted words about John Brown: "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." And there's a lot of writings about John Brown and a lot of strong negative condemnations of Brown. I've viewed several of the historic National Geographic and other videos about John Brown, and I do find a good bit of them to be inaccurate. I've read several recent books, though, that I think are the best scholarship on John Brown. And I'm going to cite one of them here, because while maybe we may not agree with Brown's approach to violence, we need to be careful about condemning his motives, because he was at war with slavery. And how can you argue with that? But that's another issue here, or another presentation. In his excellent book, John Brown's War Against Slavery, historian Robert E. McGlone best explains Brown's words. This ominous declaration would be long remembered. For knowledgeable observers, it hearkened back to the familiar words of Paul: "Almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without shedding of blood is no remission." Hebrews 9:22. But Brown's statement was not so much an appeal, sorry for the typo there, should be "and," not "and," an appeal to biblical authority as a stark warning, a chilling Jeremiad. Brown had cautioned the South in the aftermath of his capture that despite his defeat, the slavery question would not go away. Now he made that warning a prophecy. Slavery, he was saying, would end only with bloodshed. McGlone then wisely ends his book by saying, and I should tell you that many historians believe that John Brown's raid was the spark that ignited the Civil War. John Brown did not cause the Civil War, but he hastened its coming. Brown's real legacy to his guilty lad may have been to make war thinkable if subserved to a godly purpose. For thousands and 10,000s in the North, John Brown's martyrdom sanctified his cause and war itself. And if you read about the soldiers, they would sing songs about John Brown around the campfire, sometimes as they would march into war. That is, the Northern soldiers. As the decade of the 1850s came to a close, the nation was more divided than it had ever been before. Although Americans were not yet ready to take up arms, they were at a point where only a straw would break the camel's back. That straw would be the upcoming presidential election of 1860, the most fateful presidential campaign in United States history, and the succession of the southern states thereafter. And I will talk about this election and the succession when I get to Ellen White's vision before the war. That will be on Tuesday. What are some lessons we can derive from this as I bring it to a close? Well, first of all, one lesson that I will enunciate throughout this week as we go through this history. God is in control of this nation. And as we look at what's happening in our nation today, that's a good thought to keep in mind. Ellen White made this remarkable statement. In the annals of human history, the growth of nations, the rise and fall of empires appear as dependent on the will and prowess of man. The shaping of events seems to a great degree to be determined by his power, ambition, or caprice. But in the Word of God, the curtain is drawn aside, and we behold behind, above, and through all the play and counterplay of human interest and power and passions, the agencies of the all-merciful One silently, patiently working out the counsels of His own will. God was working in antebellum America. God is working in 21st century America. This nation is in His hands. It's not spoken like a dragon yet. It may be headed that way. But now we can take heart. God is in control. You believe that? Number 2, lesson 2. Our Seventh-day Adventist pioneers were very alert to the events transpiring around them. They knew what was happening. They did not have their heads stuck in the sand. They listened to the events of their day. They were news alert. But they did so one ear to the current events, the other ear to the Word of God, watching for the soon return of Jesus, interpreting all events in that backdrop. 3, they engaged with what they believed to be wrong, namely the sin of the day, slavery. They were outspoken against the social sins of their day. They held no punches. Do you think sometimes we're too politically correct today to speak the truth as we should? We hold too many punches, don't you think? I'm not advocating any radicalism here. But perhaps sometimes we're too worried about being politically correct. We perhaps hold too many punches when it comes to the truth. 4, they kept their eyes heavenward. And this is the final lesson. They kept their eyes heavenward and anticipated the soon return of Jesus. In the midst of their country, their world falling apart around them, they kept their eyes to the skies. And they were filled with the hope of Jesus' soon return. It was in their DNA as Adventists. And brothers and sisters, today, our DNA is the blessed hope. Are you looking up to the skies? That should be our posture. And as it sometimes appears, our world is falling apart. Our hope is in the promise of Jesus' soon return. Do you believe it? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your work in our history as a people, for your work in our history as a nation. In this week, as we study the Civil War during this morning hour period, and Ellen White's role in it, contributions to it, we pray for insight, for understanding, for a greater appreciation and respect of the gift of prophecy, as well as an insight into what this period of history was like and how we can learn from it. So bless us each to this end, I pray in Jesus' name.